So thank you very much to the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology for inviting me here today. It's wonderful to visit Indonesia for the first time. Thank you all for coming. I hope some of the issues I'm going to cover today, which are slightly US and European centric, as you might expect, given where I work, will raise some interesting questions for you all to think about and to discuss during today and tomorrow when considering information security, both in the narrow sense, in the computer science sense, but also in the much broader sense about how online security and privacy are affected as people move online, and particularly as governments, including Indonesia's government, develop law and policy to regulate people's behavior online. Next slide, please. So these are the four areas I'm going to cover today. I decided, because security and privacy is a very broad topic, to slightly focus in on national security, which is about, particularly in the internet context, about governments knowing what's happening online, in appropriate cases when they need to monitor the activities of people that are suspected to be breaking the law, particularly serious criminals, the ways that they can do that, the kinds of technologies that are used by governments in what's called SIGINT in English, signals intelligence or communications surveillance. I'll then talk a bit about how that is evolving particularly in Europe, where governments are interested in looking at what they call communications data, which is data about how people are using the internet, when they're connected, who they're sending email to, and so on. And some laws that Europe passed about 6 years ago now, which require that internet service providers retain some of that communications data for a fixed period of time, usually around 12 months. I'll explain to you there some of the legal framework in Europe that protects privacy, that says, okay, governments sometimes have a legitimate reason for carrying out communications surveillance, for monitoring people's emails and so on. But you need to have laws in place to make sure that that doesn't go any further than is necessary, that those powers are used for fighting serious crime and terrorism and so on, but aren't abused to, for example, monitor political opponents of the government, which is always a concern in democracies. And then the last third of my talk, I will move on to social media, like Facebook, and how this privacy in social media is protected in Europe, and how that links in with the national security concerns that I talked about earlier, because there's a huge amount of data out there on Facebook. What is it that government agencies are allowed to do in investigating criminal activity and using that data? So next slide, please. National security is a phrase that you hear very frequently in media discussion, in political discussion in Europe and in America. Often in quite vague terms, but trying to be more specific here about what does national security actually mean. So traditionally, national security activities by government would include military intelligence gathering. So certainly, if you look at, for example, the history of the development of the telephone and of radio communications in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you can see that government military forces were always very interested to see, well, if the people we are fighting are using these communications tools, how can we try to monitor them? And certainly in the First World War, the Allies they developed technology to pick up not just radio waves, which are relatively easy to pick up, obviously, because they're transmitted and travel a long way, but even communications that were being sent through cables close to the line between the opposing forces. They worked out that if the army they were fighting has maybe 100 meters away cables that are carrying sensitive communications, you might be able to pick up the radiation coming off those cables on your side of the battlefield, and work out what your enemy is saying. More recently, so perhaps certainly in the last 60 or 70 years, how national security has developed from those original concepts. So states conducting economic espionage. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union spent a lot of time spying on the West because the scientific research was so far ahead in many key industrial areas in the West, and the Soviet Union would basically steal inventions from the West and use them in the economy. And of course, that goes on today. That's actually one of the biggest threats that the UK government thinks that cybersecurity weaknesses present to the UK economy. Other governments, and indeed other large corporations, spying on their competitors in the UK, of course, other countries as well, this isn't unique to the UK, stealing trade secrets, stealing blueprints for new products and technologies. Monitoring of non-governmental organisations, so campaign groups and trade organisations. So governments, again, have to some extent a legitimate interest in what campaign groups are going to say about what the government is doing. They like to know, if they can, what the NGO is saying internally. Perhaps that's a case where they're going too far in misusing their surveillance plans. Counter-terrorism, of course, is a really critical national security issue for all governments, for the Indonesian government, for the UK government, for the American government. And that's been one of the big developments in national security over the last few decades. And I already mentioned the scientific and technical developments linked to the economic espionage argument. Next slide, please. So what does the equipment actually look like when I'm talking about communications surveillance, signals intelligence? Well, this is slightly old-fashioned now, but when a large amount of international communications were traveling by satellite during the second half of the 20th century, satellite communications are, of course, very easy to intercept because when they are beamed down from the satellite, there will be a very large area in which anybody can pick up those signals. So if you visit Northern Europe, if you go to France or the Netherlands or Belgium, for example, usually the hotels have British satellite television because they can pick it up, because the signals coming down from the satellites cover Northern Europe as well as the United Kingdom, hundreds of miles away. Similarly, if you want to listen in to the signals of telephone calls or fax or data that's being sent by satellite, well, you need a satellite dish somewhere in the area, the footprint of the signal as it's coming down from the satellite. That's what this big satellite dish in the photo is. That was a UK intelligence agency satellite dish that was listening in to the communications being sent across the Atlantic by some of the earliest transatlantic satellites. You might have heard of a report that came out of the European Parliament in the 90s that looked at the alliance of the UK, US, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, who have an intelligence alliance called the UK-USA Agreement. They collaborate in sharing intercepted communications with each other. That was one of the parts of that system is dubbed Echelon. Of course, other countries do this as well. France and Switzerland have an alliance to do this. That was dubbed Frenchelon. Actually, even multinational corporations these days have the resources to do signals intelligence and often the motivation to do it. If you're a multi-billion-dollar arms manufacturer, then you probably would like to know what your competitors are doing, especially what they are bidding for contracts, so that you can undermine them. In fact, there was allegations in the European Parliament report that I mentioned that was exactly what was happening, that American arms companies were getting intelligence from the American government, that they were using them to underbid on contracts against French defense companies. So often even countries that are allies, like the US and France in this case, they are still fierce economic competitors. Their governments are still very interested in knowing what the other government and the other companies in those countries are doing. You can see a quote there from James Woolsey, who was the Director of Central Intelligence in the US for when Bill Clinton was president. Talking to Congress, he said, we steal secrets with espionage, so that's the traditional spies with communications. I'm talking about today, and with reconnaissance satellites, so taking pictures from satellites also. Next slide, please. One thing that the internet has changed is, in parallel with the revolution in international fiber optic cable connections. You can see here a map from, this dates back to 2008, I haven't been able to find a more recent one, but I think it will still be similar. The pattern of international internet data flows. You can see the yellow lines there are showing the bandwidth of international data flows. And what's the obvious thing that stands out? Anyone want to shout out? Looking at this, what's one thing that sort of it makes you think, yes. Which country in particular a lot of international traffic is flowing through? Anyone going to shout out? Going to shout. Anyone? Well, it's the country in the middle. It's the US. Just as not in a particular plan, but it just turns out that the way that fiber cables are laid, particularly across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, you can see that's where a lot of the international traffic going across the internet is flowing. So huge amounts of traffic flowing between Europe and North America, and similarly huge amounts flowing between Eastern Asia and North America. And actually, even traffic that goes from, say, Europe to South America, or from Asia to South America, is very likely to flow through the United States and then south down to South America, and in reverse. And actually, there have been estimates that up to a third of the traffic, a third of the international traffic flowing across the internet daily will travel through the US. That's wonderful if you're an intelligence agency in the US and you want to be able to look at what traffic is flowing across the internet. Next slide, please. So these are devices that are, it's known because of a whistleblower that worked for the telephone company in ISP, AT&T. These are internet interception devices that are installed in AT&T's facilities in San Francisco, Seattle, San Jose, Los Angeles, and San Diego. So the places that are carrying all of that international traffic. And these devices can monitor very high bandwidth pipes, data pipes, 10 gigabits per second pipes. Actually, there are now devices, so this is openly advertised on the internet. You can Google this and find the company that makes it. It was an Israeli company. It was bought by Boeing a couple of years ago. There are apparently devices now which are not openly advertised, but which will monitor even faster internet links, 100 gigabit per second links, which are extremely fast. Most internet service providers, that will be pretty much the limit of the communications links that they are carrying. I won't go into the details, but basically what this device, this is a sort of schematic of what this does. What it says is you have the data flowing across this pipe down here. You have a module in the middle which can be configured by intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies saying, I'm interested in this kind of data, whether that's keywords in emails, whether it's particular sends or recipients of communications, and so on. If those keywords are found in the data flow, that data will be extracted and then passed on to the intelligence or law enforcement agency that is interested in monitoring that communications. So, next slide, please. So that's monitoring the communications, monitoring the data as it flows around the internet. Then I mentioned this communications data that internet service providers themselves have to store in Europe about what their customers are doing. And of course, then later, police and other government agencies can come along and request access to that communications data if they're investigating criminal activity. This shows you how the different member states of the European Union, how much they are using those powers, how many requests for this communications data are made each year. So these are the two-letter country codes down the side. So the UK, for example, the CZ is Czech Republic, you can see relative to its population, to its overall population, which I've scaled these graphs by, you can see the Czech Republic making a large amount of requests for communications data about what people are doing on the internet. The UK, a pretty large amount, France, a pretty large amount, Latvia, Estonia, and then you can see some other countries like Germany and Denmark, which are making much less use of these powers to go to internet service providers and access communications data. So there's been a lot of controversy in the European Union about these powers because civil liberties groups, privacy campaigns say this is going too far. This is forcing internet service providers to store data about all their customers, not just ones that are suspected of being part of criminal activity, but all of their customers all the time. ISPs are forced to keep this data, and then, as you can see from the graph, some countries in Europe are making a large number of requests for that data. So the UK, which I know best, there are about 500,000 requests each year, mainly from the police to internet service providers for these communications data requests. Next slide, please. One of the ways that data can be used, obviously it can be used if the police are investigating specific individuals that they suspect of criminal activity. But another thing that can be done with it, of course, if you have the computing power, is that you can take a lot of data and then start analysing it and looking for patterns. And wouldn't it be great if you were a government agency, a counter-terrorism agency, if you could use data mining and you could actually spot people planning terrorist attacks before they did it, and then intervene, arrest them. That's the dream. That's what a lot of the police and intelligence and other counter-terrorism agencies, certainly in the US and Europe that I know best, had hoped that they could do with this kind of interception and communications data analysis capability. In practice, though, when it's been tried, as it was in the 4 years after the 9/11 attacks in the US, it didn't work very well. In fact, it basically didn't work. What was leaked to the New York Times in 2004 was that the National Security Agency in the US, the intelligence agency that monitors communications, was trying to do this kind of data mining on all communications that were starting or finishing outside the United States. So not people's domestic communications, but international communications. The NSA, from that program, picked out about 5,000 Americans that they thought their data mining tools suggested might be engaged in terrorism or in other very serious criminal activity. But in reality, once they took just a step further and had a human being look a bit more carefully at the evidence that they had, there were fewer than 10 a year of those people that warranted even getting a warrant to then go and search their houses. So that really didn't work in the way that the US government was hoping. Later in 2008, the US National Research Council, which is a collection of senior academic experts, wrote a report on data mining and counterterrorism, and you can see their conclusion here. There's not a consensus within the scientific community whether this kind of behavioral surveillance techniques are ready for use at all in the counter-terrorist context. So this is important if you are thinking about the balance between people's privacy and powers that government agencies legitimately have to try to stop terrorism and other serious crime. Well, if all of the surveillance and the data mining doesn't actually stop any terrorism, it's very invasive of people's privacy, well, that's maybe a sign there should be less surveillance. Next slide, please. So I'll say a little bit more now about the European laws that control what European governments do when they want to do surveillance, when they want to invade people's privacy, to try to make sure that those invasive powers are only used in the right way. So the most important document in having that discussion is the European Convention on Human Rights. That was an agreement that all of the European countries in the aftermath of the Second World War signed. And one of the main reasons they developed this convention was after the horrors of the Second World War, particularly after what Germany had done in exterminating millions of Jewish people and gypsies and political opponents and gay people and a whole range of people. This convention was meant to say European countries will never allow that horror to happen again. We'll set out some limits on what governments may do that will stop that happening again, that will protect people's human rights. And one of the key human rights that's protected in that convention is to privacy. So you can see the first sub-bullet there, which says everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, his correspondence. And the correspondence then meant letters, but of course now it includes emails and other kinds of internet communications. And then another interesting question that social media raises, a broader question about privacy. Does privacy exist in public spaces? So we are in a big hall here, lots of people, cameras, and so on. You probably, I'm not expecting that anything I do up here on the stage is private. I'm expecting that all of you are hearing me. There might be a video on the internet, so this isn't private. You actually might feel this small expectation of privacy in the audience. You might not be entirely, some people, not everyone, might not be entirely happy, say if the camera was turned around and zoomed in on you, perhaps asleep. That wouldn't be something necessarily that you would want on the internet. And it's a big question. Is there privacy in public spaces? And different countries have different answers to that. So in America, generally, the answer would be no. Anything you do in public is completely public. So, you're out walking the streets with your girlfriend or boyfriend, someone takes a picture, sends it to your parents, well, tough luck, sure embarrassed. Or shops have surveillance cameras, they can do whatever they like with the photo. Even if say, you were mugged, say you were attacked. That happened in public, the journalists might take a picture. You might not necessarily want that picture being on the front page of a newspaper of you all beaten up, pouring with blood perhaps. But in general in the US, tough. Europe is the opposite. So again, because Europe has a very strong focus on privacy as a right, European law says you do have an expectation of privacy sometimes in public. So to give you some specific examples, one of the royal family in Monaco, one of the German royal family, I think it's confusing these little countries like Monaco. One of the Monaco royal family was on a beach. A photographer took a picture from quite a distance away of that person in swimwear, and then published it in German newspapers. She was on a beach. It was a public beach. But actually the European court said, well, no, if you are walking on the beach, you don't want journalists taking pictures of you and selling them to news magazines. To give you another example, in Britain, if you know Naomi Campbell, who's quite a famous supermodel, she, at one point, I think in the 90s, was getting treatment for drug addiction. And she was coming out of the addiction clinic, may have been out of addiction, one of the two. And someone took a photo of her coming out of the addiction clinic, published it in a newspaper, said to everybody, this person is receiving treatment for addiction. And she sued the newspaper and said, you invaded my privacy, and the courts agreed. So in Europe, often you do have some privacy rights, even when you are outside your home, outside your office, in public. So this becomes a big issue with tools like Google Street Maps, which you can see here. Obviously, when Google's little cars are driving around, taking pictures of the streets to put onto street maps, sometimes they capture people out in the streets. And I don't know how clearly you can see this photo, but it's of a pickup truck with someone who'd fallen asleep in the truck and with two family members. And again, if you were that person lying there, you know, with your belly exposed, you might not necessarily want that photo turning up on the internet to anyone that used Google Street Maps. Google said, well, this isn't a problem, this is public. What are you complaining about? And again, that argument worked in the United States, but it didn't work in Europe, where privacy regulators said, no, Google can't just go around taking pictures of people in the streets or in their houses even, through the windows, and putting them up. And so then what Google tried to do was say, okay, we will try to blur out the faces of people that get captured. So you can't really see it here, but these people, the faces are blurred, so you wouldn't necessarily immediately recognize these people. The problem with that as an approach, though, of course, is that there is other information often available that will identify them anyway. So, of course, it's Google Maps. Here's the map. You can see where the truck is parked. If that's their house, well, then you know who it is. You know where they live. And this is something the internet actually makes quite tricky in protecting privacy. There's so much information online about people now that even when you take steps to try to protect privacy by blurring faces, for example, often it's not enough. There are other bits of information out there that allows the data to be, that allows the people to be identified anyway, even after you've taken those steps. Next slide, please. So, I covered a lot there, but to try to bring together some of those themes. Ironically, in the 1990s, the signals intelligence agencies I told you about were very worried that as communications moved to fiber optic cables and moved to the internet, they would become much harder to intercept. The SIGINT agencies were used to intercepting satellite communications and microwave communications and radio communications. And I thought, well, fiber optic cables, how do we intercept those? They're at the bottom of the ocean, literally. But as I described, they have developed technology, and private companies have developed technology that actually make it very easy to intercept communications on the internet, to gather a huge amount of information about people from their communications, from these communications records, this communications data, from social media sites, from things people are doing, leaving comments on blogs, putting videos on YouTube, tweeting, status updates, and so on and so on. You think yourself how much information is online that you put there, you chose to put on the internet. How much control do you have over it? European countries are trying to make their privacy laws keep up with all of this, to make sure people do have the right to privacy online as well as offline. But it's a constant battle because technology is changing so quickly, and so privacy law is really struggling to keep up. If anyone, I'll be happy to take questions, and also if any of you have any comments about the Indonesian situation, about your privacy laws, about your surveillance laws and so on, I would be very interested to hear those. So thank you for listening, and does anybody have any questions or comments? Someone this time? You?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, the program wants to get your sharing of information. In the last UNGA meeting, one of the law which was submitted and proposed to be discussed is the August law. August law.
Yes.
And one of the topics in August law well, there are many topics, including the satellite slots and so on. But one of the topics is how you measure the privacy law, the privacy of people. When the UK has a satellite there, and can soon, to me, when I take the bus in my, in the back of my home, suddenly, the UK Intelligence Agency can say, that Aswin is taking part. I mean, I used to do that. It's common for people to take the bus and get out from my bedroom or with sarung. In Indonesia, use sarung. Everybody uses it when they sleep. What is the current situation for that auto space zooming?
That's a very good question, and I didn't know that the discussions at the UN on space law included privacy. That's fascinating. So you're right. One of the broader issues that I didn't mention, but is very relevant to this question is how far do intelligence agencies in the UK and in other countries actually follow these privacy laws? You might say everything I just said about privacy law. Sure, the UK shouldn't be doing that, zooming into people's back gardens. One of the difficulties in enforcing laws like these human rights laws within intelligence agencies, of course, is what they do is very secret. And they are very careful about who knows what they are doing. This is obvious because photos show up on the internet and you can work out what the capabilities of these satellites are. It's relatively public knowledge when satellites are launched. You can see them being launched, obviously, and you can estimate, even if you don't see the actual pictures, you can estimate the capabilities of the satellites and how good the photos might be from space. And you're right, they could be very, very good. I mean, even 10 years ago, people were claiming that the most sophisticated spy satellites could tell whether a coin had a head or a tail, face up from space. And that sounds plausible to me, and certainly today, 10, 15 years later, obviously, as the cameras get better and better and the computer processing gets better and better of the images. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think intelligence agencies in general, certainly in the UK, could do with being more open about how they are complying with privacy law. And nor do I think they should, which they do, generally concern themselves about the privacy of their own citizens, but not so much about other countries' citizens.
Yeah, but you can do with Google Maps and Google Street View.
You can do what? See into people's back gardens?
Almost similar things.
Some similar things. You wouldn't get nearly so much coverage. So in general, the Street View cameras are at this height. So if your fence is any higher than this, they won't see into your back garden. I mean, that's a simple protection, but a useful one. That's one of the things that people were upset with Street View, that it was seeing into their houses. Because something, if the house was close to the street and the curtains were open, then there might be a picture in their house, and people do tend to feel their homes and their back gardens are private spaces. Shouldn't just be invaded by technology companies just because they can. Other questions? Lots of questions. Good.
Hello, my name is Yuga. I'm a lecturer in Public Cost. I want to ask about if there any research about security and privacy on cyberspace. I'm very interested to research in that topic. Thank you.
So you asked what research is there on security and privacy in cyberspace? Okay, a huge amount. That was one reason that I tried to focus in today on national security. Obviously, there's lots of other areas of information security that I could have covered. There are journals you could look at, sort of the big professional societies like the ACM, the IIIE publish a number of journals. They have big conferences every year. There's one held every year in Oakland, for example, called IIIE Security and Privacy, that's very well known. Google will find you millions and millions of journal articles and conference papers And a good thing is a lot of computer scientists will put all of their journal articles on their own web pages, so you don't even need to be a member of the IIIE or have your university library subscribe to all these journals. Often you can find them online yourself. So there's a very broad range of stuff that you can look at, and I encourage you to explore it.
Okay, I have a question in terms of lawful interception and commercial entities.
Yep.
What is the state of the art? For example, friends who are running, say, ISP and service providers, they're worried that the government asks them to put up their log files and things like that, you know, in terms of corruption investigation or terrorism and things like that.
Yep.
What is the state of the art? Because they think that, you know, we have to protect our customers. Privacy of our customers, but the government said we have to protect the nation and
yes.
Like that. So what's the state?
So the state of the art in terms of the interception devices themselves, as I showed you with that Naris one, is pretty advanced. So if somebody wants to intercept some of the links in your friend's ISP, if they can get physical access to the communications links, they can plug in one of those boxes. If your friend's ISP is quite small, it's probably working with a bigger ISP. It will be connected to some bigger ISPs so that the data can flow outwards onto the global internet. So even if your friend's network is not being intercepted, the bigger ISPs may well be. The data is flowing there anyway. The important thing, of course, is not to say that governments should never intercept communications. Sometimes they have very good reason to, and they're trying to stop terrorism and investigate a serious crime. The important thing is to make sure there's a process to allow those legitimate purposes, but make sure that the powers aren't abused. And so in many countries, I'm sorry I don't know the Indonesian rules, but certainly in North America and in Europe, in most countries, a judge will have to give a warrant saying, yes, I agree with the police or the investigating agency, this is a serious crime, it justifies intercepting communications, and then the ISP will carry it out. I think that's the best way to do it. That's one of the reasons that the UK bill that I talked about is so controversial. It doesn't have that step. It tells ISPs store all of this huge amount of data about what your customers are doing all over the internet, and then later on, various government agencies will come along without a judge warrant and access that data, and that makes many English people very nervous.
What if the ISPs, they actually don't store the log because they don't want to? Is that possible, or are they allowed to do that, or they have to provide the kind of a trail for the government? Mandatory.
So that's a good point. So yes, one way, obviously, if you're an ISP and you're in a country where you think perhaps the laws aren't properly protecting the privacy of your customers, you can choose not to keep the logs. Often what happens then is, okay, well then the government passes a law saying that you must keep a log, and that's what the data retention laws were that I mentioned. So one of the worries that led to those data retention laws was mobile phones, which are also covered. Many people in UK and most other countries now have pay-as-you-go phones, rather than being a customer, rather than signing up with a mobile provider. So they go and buy a SIM at a shop, a prepaid SIM. They don't have to register. They don't have to give their details to the mobile phone company. And that was something European governments were a bit worried about. And so that was one reason that they passed these laws. Another reason, often these laws are driven by a big event, like, for example, the 9/11 attacks in the US led to all of the wiretapping by the NSA that I told you about. There was a big bombing in London in 2005, which was one of the main things that led to the European data retention law that I told you about, because there's an understandable urge from police and intelligence agencies when something like that happens to say, we must have all the data we can to catch the people that did this and to stop it happening again. Of course, almost everyone would say they should they should have the data that they need when it can help them do that. At the same time, you don't want things to swing completely too far and to say, okay, we'll just collect everything all the time, just in case, because one thing that often happens is it's not even worrying about corruption or politicians misusing the data, it's just all sorts of other uses for the data being found. So the data might start off being kept only for the investigation of very serious crime, but then very quickly start being requested by people investigating file sharing MP3s on peer-to-peer networks. That's exactly what happened, in fact, in Europe. That the record companies came along and said, ISPs are keeping all this data for the police. Why can't we have it? Because people are sharing music and are destroying our businesses.
Okay, question is, Dr. Ian. Regarding your presentation regarding the security and privacy, I mean, my concern is I want to know about more about the individual concern that you said in your presentation. Individual concern. If there is any best practice in other countries in regulating individual concern or optional policy, meaning that I can get if someone wants sending information, they have to get permission before sending the information. Is there any best practice in other countries making regulation regarding individual consent or option policy?
Let's try to understand your question. So, what kind of data is being sent? Who by that you're interested in?
In case looking at the Indonesian experience, many of our people have received many messages from, for example, phone number. For example, like the selling product to the selling product and send information through the SMS. So I mean, like the provider haven't get permission to the receiver. So I mean, like there's so I mean, like before they sending the message or information, they have to get permission from the receiver.
So you mean like spam?
Yeah, like spam.
Yes. Yeah. So yes, indeed. And again, the US and EU have taken slightly different approaches. So the US has a law called the Can-Spam Act, and what that says is that people sending messages like advertising emails or SMSs have to make it clear it's an advert, so they have to put advert in the subject line, for example, and also they have to give you a way to opt out. The European Union has gone a bit further, and it said that companies can only send you advertising messages, basically if you've consented to receive them, or if you are already a customer of that company. Enforcing that law is not easy, because often it's, the people sending the spam messages are often slightly shady companies. They might pop up, send 10 million spam emails and then disappear. It might be quite hard to find out where the messages came from and track down the people that sent them and then find them or send them to jail. But certainly I can send you links to the European laws about this and explain how they work, if that's helpful later. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
About you talking about the law regulation about the citizens and the government, is it probably because we want to use Facebook, we want to use Google, or everything it's so simple, and then once people, government want to try to take control, and then Facebook make it spread down into the security setting and everything, and then everything more complex now. The internet world is much more complex. But the problem is, we citizens cannot understand the full complexity of it. We're just users. Much of it, we're just users to know I can sue people when they're paying me or something. So, what I'm trying to say is, isn't that complexity is a whole itself in security? Because without the rules, without the hundreds of, probably millions of the bill itself, I could not know what's my right, what could I do, what could you do to me? So, yeah.
Yes, that's a good point. A good 2 points that often to use sites like Facebook safely and securely and privately, it often is very complicated. If you look at Facebook privacy settings, there are scores and scores of them. I think there were 155 the last time I read a paper, and there are probably more now. And most of you probably sort of look at that and think, oh, I just want to use Facebook. I just want to talk to my friends. I don't want to have to think about these complicated privacy settings. And that's one of the reasons that I mentioned why default settings are important. So what you really want is, you sign up to Facebook, and then by default, the privacy settings are things that, by and large, you are happy with, that will protect you, that won't show embarrassing photos of you to your teachers or bosses or parents, for example. The slight problem is, often it's in the commercial interest of companies like Facebook to have the opposite default settings. They don't want everything to be private. Actually, it helps their business if everything is much more shared, because it will encourage other people to join Facebook and to start sharing. And so that's the reason why I think the kind of privacy laws that we have in Europe are important. American companies often criticize them and say they're very bureaucratic, they get in the way of innovation and new companies like Facebook. And surely, if Facebook users cared about privacy, then they would force Facebook to look after privacy. In reality, as you know, that isn't what is happening. So I think there is some need for laws to protect citizens. But you're also right, your second point, that often, how do citizens know what those laws are and what their rights are? I think partly that's something that schools and universities should teach people so that they understand. Not just law students, but other students of other subjects. But there's a limit to how far you can go with that. Obviously, unless you're a full-time lawyer, you can't spend all your time sitting around all day reading the law and understanding what it means. So that's a difficult one, right?
Okay. I just wondering what the policy for the satellite in Northern Europe, because you told us that in Europe there is a free signal satellite and everyone can use it. What the policy there?
I didn't mean everyone can use it. What I meant was, if people want to intercept the satellite signal as it travels down from the satellite, it's relatively easy to do that. You can buy technical equipment that would listen to the satellite signal and let you hear the communications in them. In many countries that's illegal. It's illegal to intercept people's communications without specific legal permission, unless you're a government agency that has specific permission to do it. But of course that doesn't stop people doing it. And one of the big developments in mobile phones over the last 15 years, when mobile phones first became popular, the huge chunky ones that you see in films and TV programs from the 1980s, they had almost no security, and so anyone basically who was near where you were using your mobile phone could intercept your mobile phone calls. And in the UK, there were a number of cases where journalists did that to celebrities and to politicians and to members of the royal family. So, for example, Prince Charles, the Queen's oldest son in England, a journalist recorded a very intimate conversation that he was having with the woman who he's now married to, but at the time he was married to somebody else, and the newspaper published the details of the phone call. So mobile phone security, fortunately, has massively improved since then. So the radio signal between your mobile phone and the network, the mobile phone mast that's closest, is encrypted. So even if someone is intercepting the radio signal, unless they've got an amazing cryptographer working for them, have no chance of decrypting it. Actually, even if they have amazing cryptographers working for them, it's not trivial. Some of the cryptographic standards used in mobile phones are getting a bit old now, and so actually you can break some of them quite easily. but you don't have to worry too much yet about your mobile phone calls being intercepted.
Yes. Thank you very much, sir. My name is Edward, for private sector. Actually, when we deal with the privacy law, it closely related to the cultures, sometimes policy and the national interest. Since Europe and United States has already had a strong background on the privacy laws, do you have any suggestions for us which live in Asia? Of course, we have different cultures and different knowledge about the privacy law. Do you have any key points based on your knowledge or your experience on how that our people or our governments here start to implement or start to preparing the national privacy laws, which sometimes when we deal with the internet, it will collide with some other nations' law systems, or sometimes in some other cultures. Is there any key points that needs to consider when we start to creating or starting to set the privacy laws, especially for the ICT's implementation in Indonesia? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. You're absolutely right that different countries and different cultures think about human rights in different ways, including privacy. Many countries in the world, including, I'm pretty sure, Indonesia, signed the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in the 1960s. And that does include privacy, although at a very high level. You're right, it doesn't go into the specifics. I think two key things I would suggest to your question. One is a very particular reason for a country to pass a privacy law which is like the European privacy law is if you want your businesses to be able to exchange personal data with European companies. So if you're an outsourcing company, for example, in Indonesia, and you want to sign a deal with a European company, so that company will send data about its customers to you for processing, it's much easier for you as a business if your country has a privacy law like the European Union's. If you don't, then you'll have to go through all sorts of extra steps to write things into the contract that you have extra protections for the data before the European company will be allowed to send it to you. European companies aren't allowed to send personal data to countries unless those countries have good privacy laws or unless the contract that they have signed has equivalent privacy protection. So that's one consideration, and that has led many countries around the world to pass laws like Europe's. I think the count is up to about 18 countries, including the European countries, have these style of quite strong data protection laws. The more fundamental point, setting aside that particular pragmatic consideration, is human rights and constitutional rights are something that people need to democratically decide. It's something that people elected to Parliament, or perhaps even the whole country in a referendum, need to discuss and debate and think about the details and work out what they want the national law to look like before the law is passed. And that's the only way that you can pass privacy laws that will have widespread support. It's no good a government just saying, we're just going to write a privacy law and pass it, push it through Parliament, and there we are. Because there might be things in it that people are very unhappy about. So it's that broad discussion and debate and agreement that's really important for these fundamental rights. And of course, how Indonesia or how other Asian countries decide to implement privacy might look quite different to how Europe decides to implement it or how the United States decides to implement it. And of course, that is the sovereign right of the people in all of those countries. Any more questions?
Good.
Yeah.
I'm very interested about the excellent program that showed earlier about government and government steering others' government secret. Recently, I read about Huawei that have been discredited by American government, U.S. government, because they have suspectedly backdoor in their hardware or equipment, telco equipment. How do you think about that phenomenon? Backdoor in business and telecom products. Thank you.
And I'll make this my last answer so that we can go for coffee. That's a very good question. So for those of you that haven't seen the news just today and yesterday, the US Congress has just published a report saying that two Chinese companies, Huawei and ZTE, basically are a threat to US national security because the telecommunications equipment and networks that they build and run might contain backdoors for whether it's the Chinese government or other governments. I think perhaps the report is slightly overstated. I think it's an easy way for any national parliament to sort of be patriotic and nationalistic and say we shouldn't buy other countries' telecommunications equipment. We should buy our own country's companies' equipment. Having said that, I think that it's a very important point for all governments and for businesses to think about when they are setting up national mobile phone networks, setting up telecommunications systems within government agencies. What exactly is in those systems? What exactly is the equipment doing? Of course, computer equipment is incredibly complicated these days. The software that's running on those systems might have millions, almost certainly will have millions or tens of millions of lines of code. And even if the company will let you, as a government agency, look at the source code, it might be quite hard to actually find a well-hidden backdoor in the source code or in the hardware of the equipment. So what some governments do, including the UK's, for example, is for sensitive networks like military networks and diplomatic and intelligence networks, they are very, very careful about what equipment they will use. For broader government networks, they aren't so careful because actually it's very expensive and very time-consuming to be so careful as they are with very sensitive networks. This is my final point. There's a wonderful paper, a really classic computer science paper, if you want to look at why this is so hard. It's called Reflections on Trusting Trust, published by the ACM, which if you search online you will find it. And what that says is basically it's almost impossible to find backdoors in computing systems. Because even if you have access to all the source code and all the software, do you know how the compiler works? Are you sure there isn't a backdoor hidden in the compiler that will turn the source code into the executable software? Are you sure there isn't something hidden in the chips that are running the PCs that are running the software? Unless you designed and built the entire thing from start to finish, which is very, very unlikely these days, that even the very largest governments, like the US government, would be willing to spend the kind of money that it would take to design and build a chip, operating system, application software, and everything connected to your system. That's the only way you will get total security. Even then, of course, are you really sure that everyone working on the project isn't going to slip a backdoor in? It's a very difficult problem, and governments obviously are aware of it and just have to be careful, and they know full well that often their secrets are not going to be completely secret from everyone. Almost certainly, if an intelligence agency from a large, well-resourced country like not just the US, China, probably India, there are several in the UK, they all spend very large amounts of money on their intelligence agencies, and if they want to find something out, it's really quite hard to stop. So that's a good point for me to stop. Thank you.